Why was the wind screaming that night, as if it carried a warning no one was ready to hear? The plateau stretched for miles, a barren, bruised world of stone and wind. Nothing soft lived up here. The air itself was a weapon, sharp, unrelenting. Even the clouds looked carved, not formed, their edges shredded by gusts that could knock a man to his knees. And yet this was where the team had been sent, a joint task force, a handful of operators, engineers, and one quiet lieutenant whose name most couldn't even recall without glancing at their roster. Her name was Elena Lynn Morales. 26, 5'4", compact frame, eyes like steel polished by sleepless nights. Her call sign Little Atlas, the kind of nickname soldiers make up to sound harmless, then forget who gave it to her. She stood beside the trucks that morning, silent as the wind cuffed her hair across her face. Around her, the others talked in shorthand, coordinates, fire missions, movement orders, but none of it reached her. It wasn't that she didn't understand. It was that no one asked her to. "Let the men handle this," someone said at the map table. The others chuckled, not cruelly, just habitually, like it was the way things had always been. Alina didn't answer. She just took out her notebook, weatherproof, its pages stained by rain and graphite, and began writing. Wind vectors, humidity, density, altitude, each number more precise than the last. That was her domain, the invisible math of survival. She wasn't infantry. She wasn't a sniper. Officially, her task was logistics, artillery correction, meteorology. To them, she was the weather girl. But out here on the plateau, the wind decided everything, and she knew its language better than anyone else alive. The mission was simple on paper: stop the enemy artillery on the northern ridge from striking an evacuation convoy below. Simple until the ground began to move. By midday, the plateau's surface shook with the distant rumble of enemy guns. Dust rose in curtains, turning the horizon into fog. Radio chatter cracked into static, GPS jammed, comms unreliable. The task force dug in along a rock basin for cover. Then came the first salvo, high-velocity shells slamming the ridge, raining shrapnel. A SEAL went down, then another. "Smoke out," someone yelled, but there was no smoke left. The medical tape soaked red, the ground trembling under every new impact. And then silence. Not peace, but that strange pause before everything collapses. In the stillness, Alina looked up. Her pencil paused halfway across the page. The wind had changed. It wasn't random, it was rotating. A katabatic spiral, cold air descending the slope in waves. To anyone else, just weather. To her, opportunity. But no one saw it yet. "Wind's useless now," a sergeant muttered. "No shot stable in that." He turned to her with a smirk. "What's the plan, Lieutenant? Gonna calculate us a miracle." Alina met his eyes, didn't blink. "I'm going to find you a window," she said softly. The men laughed again, not out of cruelty but disbelief. They'd been trained for years in marksmanship and assault tactics, not to take orders from someone whose toolkit was a notebook and a pencil stub. But Alina had learned long ago, being underestimated was its own kind of armor. She had grown up in a high plateau town where storms rolled in faster than words. Her father was a maintenance worker, her mother a teacher. The sound of wind howling through power lines was the soundtrack of her childhood. While other kids built snow forts, she built makeshift anemometers from soda cans and string, watching how the air spoke before the storm hit. When her sniper instructor, the one who had believed in her, was killed in the field, she kept the brass casing from his final mission. She threaded it onto a paracord and wore it around her neck ever since. 3 words etched into the metal: hold, calm, wind. A message, a promise, a law. She touched it now, feeling the chill of brass against her skin. "When people don't see you," her instructor had said once, "you can move through places they think have no roads." Maybe this was one of those moments. The next explosion shook dust down from the ridge. Shrapnel sliced into the sandstone. A JTAC, the air controller, shouted into his headset. "No GPS lock. The birds can't find the target. We're blind here." Blind. That word lodged in her mind. Elena looked across the ravine and spotted something, a sharp spire of stone rising like a blade from the plateau's surface. Needle Rock. 800 meters away, 30 meters high, smooth basalt polished by centuries of wind. If she could place a reflective prism at its summit, the JTAC could use an optical lock for the laser designator. GPS wouldn't matter. The airstrike could land with surgical precision. But the wind made climbing nearly impossible. Two of the strongest men tried first. One slipped. The other was thrown sideways when a gust hit. Their rope screamed against stone before both tumbled back down. A drone was launched, flipped over midair and fell like a broken bird. The sergeant spat in frustration. "It's suicide. Nobody's getting up there." Elena's fingers traced the titanium climbing anchor in her vest pocket. "I can," she said. They thought she was joking. But she was. As the next gust tore across the plateau, she began wrapping tape around her palms. Tight, methodical. One of the medics shouted over the wind, "Ma'am, what are you doing?" "Climbing," she answered. The sergeant barked, "You're not serious. That rock will skin you alive. You'll be off the face in seconds." Elena glanced at her wristwatch. The one synced to her wind cycle notes. She counted silently, 3 gusts, 2, 1. Then she stepped forward into the storm. The wind hit like a wall. Sand bit into her cheeks. But she didn't fight it. She moved with it. Her fingertips searched for the faint seams in the rock, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Her boots, custom-soled for traction, clung to the basalt surface. Every movement had rhythm, like a waltz between flesh and air. Below her, chaos raged, shouting gunfire, explosions echoing off the cliffs. But up here, there was only the sound of wind, and the heartbeat steadying itself to match its pulse. She climbed not with strength, but with precision, the way she had lived her whole life. When she reached halfway, a gust slammed her sideways. Her anchor line snapped taut, humming like a violin string. She pressed her face against the stone and waited 3 seconds, 5, until the pressure broke, then moved again. Her instructor's voice echoed in her mind. "The wind doesn't fight you, you fight yourself." From the basin below, the men watched through scopes. "She's still going," one whispered. Another said softly, "She's not climbing against it, she's riding it." When she finally reached the top, her arms trembled, not from fear, from timing every muscle to the rhythm of invisible currents. She unhooked the prism from her pouch, mounted it on a flat ridge, and adjusted its angle to catch the northern line of sight. The beacon glowed faintly, reflecting the laser from below. "JTAC, this is Morales," she whispered into the radio, voice steady despite the wind. Optical marker placed, ready for lock. Seconds later, a digital tone, beep, lock. Coordinates stabilized on the JTAC's display. For the first time in hours, they had a fixed point. But the enemy wasn't blind either. From their ridge position, they saw movement on the spire. Artillery crews began to pivot their barrels. They were targeting her. She lay flat on the stone, adjusting her rifle. The SR-25 rested against her shoulder, modified for wind correction. Her notebook opened beside her with hand-written calculations. Minus 0.6 mil spin drift, plus 0.2 Coriolis. She didn't need time to aim. She'd already measured every gust. Her target wasn't the soldiers. It was the propellant canister beside their ammo crates, one careless placement behind a sandbag wall. She waited for the wind's pulse to open its brief stillness. 2 seconds of silence in a world of chaos. Then she exhaled halfway and fired. A single, cold crack split the air. The canister ignited. A spark became a flare. The flare became a chain reaction. Fire rolled across the north shoulder like thunder given form. The gun crews scattered. Shells detonated out of sequence. And for a moment, the plateau itself glowed. Below, the men stared in stunned silence. One whispered, "If the sniper's dead, who just made that shot?" The answer was written against the sky. A small figure at the top of Needle Rock, motionless as smoke rose around her. The one they'd told to stay behind the truck. She descended as she had climbed, measured, calm, methodical. When her boots touched ground again, no one spoke. The sergeant who had mocked her stood at attention, helmet under arm. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I was wrong." Elena only nodded. Her hands were bleeding. Her notebook was soaked through, but her voice was even. "Wind's still changing," she said. "Better adjust your next volley." No one laughed this time. That night, as medics tended the wounded, and the evacuation convoy moved safely through the ravine, she sat beside the trucks cleaning her rifle. The brass shell casing around her neck gleamed faintly in the firelight. "Hold. Calm. Wind." The three words whispered through the plateau, a language only she could hear. She didn't look for praise, didn't ask for acknowledgement. But the men around her began speaking differently. Not about the logistics girl, but about the one who read the wind. And somewhere in the static of the returning radio signal, a legend began forming. Of a small lieutenant who climbed into a storm and bent the sky to her will. Why did no one speak her name that night? Not out of disrespect, but out of awe. The plateau had gone quiet after the last explosion. The echo of fire still trembled through the air, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Black smoke coiled up into the broken sky. The ridge that had once housed enemy artillery now burned like a collapsing star. In the basin below, soldiers sat against the rocks, exhausted, bleeding, stunned. The silence wasn't peace. It was disbelief made visible. Someone whispered, "She did it." Another replied softly, "No one could have done that." And yet she had. Elena Morales stood apart from them, her silhouette small against the flames, her rifle slung across her shoulder, her hands trembling as she packed away her climbing gear, but her face calm, almost detached, like she was already measuring tomorrow's wind. The shell casing at her throat glinted every time the firelight shifted. Three words etched into brass: "Hold, calm, wind." To anyone else, just a trinket. To her, the only compass she ever needed. Hours later, back at the temporary outpost, the debrief began. It wasn't supposed to. Everyone was too tired, too shaken, but protocol demanded it even after miracles. The JTAC, call sign Mason, stood before the holographic terrain projection, replaying the data from the last 30 minutes. He pointed to the optical telemetry graph, voice dry from smoke. "Lock established here, right before the wind window closed. Whoever mounted that prism, that's why the strike hit dead on." The commanding officer frowned. Who did mount the prism? None of the climbers made it halfway. No one spoke. The silence stretched thin. Then a young specialist raised his hand slightly. "Sir, it was Lieutenant Morales." The commander blinked. "Morales, the weather officer." "Yes, sir." "She climbed that in full wind shear." "Yes, sir." "With no belay." "Yes, sir." The room went still. Mason finally spoke, voice low. "She didn't climb against it. She timed it. She moved with the gusts." He paused, almost reverent. It was like watching the wind itself take human shape. No one laughed this time. No one even breathed wrong. Because every man in that tent knew they'd witnessed something they'd never be able to explain on a report. Outside, the plateau cooled under the night. The wind carried the metallic scent of burnt propellant. Elena sat on an ammo crate, elbows on knees, watching the stars emerge one by one. She wasn't thinking about the mission. She was thinking about her notebook, still soaked and half torn, the margins filled with calculations written between breaths. Her fingers brushed the pages gently, as if touching something alive. Lines of math, lines of memory. She remembered writing her first wind correction years ago, back when she was just a cadet nobody believed belonged in field ops. Wind is not the enemy, it's the message. Now that message had saved an entire team. Footsteps crunched the gravel. The SEAL commander approached, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, eyes that had seen too many operations blur together. He stopped beside her and removed his cap. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you've just rewritten our definition of logistics." Elena gave a faint, tired smile. "I just did my job, sir." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You did the job, the one no one thought possible." He stood beside her in silence for a moment, watching the stars. Then he added, "For what it's worth, we won't be using that phrase anymore." She looked up, puzzled. "What phrase, sir?" "Let the men handle this." He said it like a confession, like an apology the wind might carry farther than words ever could. Elena didn't answer, she just nodded, because forgiveness wasn't what she wanted. Respect wasn't earned by speeches, it was earned by doing what others couldn't. At dawn, they began evacuation. The sky had cleared, but the wind hadn't softened. Dust swirled in long horizontal ribbons, glowing gold in the rising light. The wounded were loaded first. The rest checked gear, and silence filled the spaces where laughter usually lived. As the trucks rumbled down the slope, someone began a quiet story, told in the way soldiers pass on myths before they even know they're myths. She climbed it in full gusts. Used the wind as cover. Timed the vortex to the millisecond. Shot a propellant canister from 800 meters. Destroyed an entire artillery nest. Each man added something, not lies but reverence amplified through wonder. By the time the convoy reached the lower ridge, the story already had a name. The girl who tied the wind. But not everyone was at peace. For Elena, the victory felt like static, unfinished, unsteady. She couldn't stop replaying the moments on the climb, the wind slamming her sideways, the second she thought the anchor might slip, the 2 seconds of stillness before she fired. In those seconds, she'd felt something deeper than fear, clarity. The absolute blinding clarity that comes when the world narrows into one choice. But clarity fades. And now the noise returned, the questions, the doubts, the weight. In the privacy of her tent, she unrolled her notebook, flipped to a blank page and wrote a single line. "Precision is not peace." She stared at it for a long time, then closed the book. By afternoon, the unit had reached the forward operating base, a sprawl of dust-colored tents and shipping containers turned into offices. The mission report had already been transmitted ahead of them. When Elena entered the briefing room, a few heads turned. Conversations dimmed. It wasn't hostility, it was quiet curiosity. The intelligence officer looked up from his tablet. "Lieutenant Morales, you're the one who established the optical fix on Needle Rock." "Yes, sir." He tapped his stylus against the screen, frowning. "GPS denied, high wind, full crossfire, and you climbed it manually." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll make sure the commendation draft reflects that." Elena shifted her weight, uncomfortable. "Sir, that's not necessary. The mission succeeded because of the team." He smiled faintly. "The team succeeded because you made a point that didn't move." That line would repeat later, in debriefs, in reports, in whispers down the hall. She made a point that didn't move. That evening, while others rested or cleaned gear, Elena walked outside the wire to where the plateau stretched into shadow. She crouched beside a cluster of rocks, the wind lifting her hair again. She could still see Needle Rock in the distance, black against the red horizon. The prism she'd mounted would still be there, glinting faintly with reflected light. She wondered if anyone else would ever climb it again. Probably not. Maybe that was the point. Some things were meant to stand untouched, markers of what's possible when doubt falls silent. Behind her, she heard boots crunching gravel. The sergeant from the basin, the one who told her to stay behind the truck. He stopped a few paces away, helmet under his arm. "Permission to speak, ma'am." She didn't turn. "Granted." He hesitated, then said quietly, "I misjudged you." Alina smiled faintly. Everyone does, until the wind changes. He exhaled a short laugh through his nose. "Guess I'll be reading it a lot closer from now on." She looked at him then, really looked. Not as a soldier to a subordinate, but as someone seeing recognition where there used to be doubt. "You don't need to say anything," she said. "Just remember what we learned out there." He nodded, staring out toward Needle Rock. "What's that, ma'am?" "That sometimes," she said, "the storm doesn't mean stop, it means move differently." Later that night, as the camp generators hummed and the smell of coffee mingled with diesel, Alina found herself sitting alone again. She pulled out her shell casing, held it between thumb and forefinger. The engraving had begun to fade, but she could still feel the grooves. Hold. Calm. Wind. She thought of her instructor, of how he used to say the hardest part of any mission wasn't the action, it was being invisible, being dismissed, and staying silent until it mattered. Maybe that's what she'd really done today, not proven her strength, but her patience. The night air cooled. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faintly. Alina tilted her head, listening. The wind had shifted again. Inside the communications tent, radio chatter picked up, messages bouncing between units. Somewhere her name had begun to circulate. Not Lieutenant Morales. Not the weather officer. Just little Atlas. A call sign that had once been a joke now carried weight. She carried the wind on her back, one operator said into the mic. "Small shoulders, big sky," another replied. Legends have strange ways of being born, sometimes from victory, sometimes from silence, and sometimes from a single act no one expected. Alina returned to her bunk, exhaustion pressing down like gravity. She lay back, staring at the canvas ceiling above her. She didn't think about recognition or reports. She thought about the climb, about how quiet the world had been when she reached the top, the kind of quiet you only hear when the earth itself listens. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered the same 3 words she always had. Hold. Calm. Wind. Outside, the gusts swept over the plateau, whispering back, as if the world had learned to speak her language. Why do legends always travel faster than truth? By morning, the story had already escaped the wire. It drifted on radio waves and whispered channels, retold by men who didn't even know her name. They say she climbed a rock in a hurricane. No, a sandstorm. She made the wind stop. She hit the target blindfolded. Each version stretched a little further, as if awe demanded exaggeration. Out here, truth never stayed pure. It became a survival myth, something to believe in when everything else was chaos. And somewhere in the center of all those rumors sat Alina Morales, trying and failing to stay invisible. The operations center buzzed with motion. Analysts hunched over laptops, commanders argued over maps. The plateau had shifted from battlefield to symbol overnight. Reporters embedded with other units sent inquiries. Command wanted official statements. Alina sat at a corner desk, her notebook open to a fresh page. Numbers filled the margins, wind gradients, pressure shifts, forecast probabilities. Work, quiet, controllable, simple. She felt safer in equations than in people's eyes. A young officer, barely 20, approached her table. He held a coffee cup like it was an offering. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say what you did out there." She didn't look up. "Finish your coffee before it gets cold, Lieutenant. The weather doesn't pause for compliments." He stammered, nodded, and left. Elena exhaled. The more people tried to thank her, the more she wanted to disappear. Outside, the wind carried fragments of conversation. Morales locked a beacon with her bare hands. She calculated wind like she heard it. She didn't miss a single factor. She kept walking past it all. Everywhere she went, heads turned. It wasn't malice, it was recognition, the sudden weight of being seen by those who once ignored you. And yet, it felt heavier than invisibility ever did. She'd been built for quiet efficiency, not for legend. The noise of admiration cut sharper than the noise of gunfire. That night, a formal commendation draft arrived from command headquarters. First Lieutenant Elena Morales demonstrated extraordinary initiative and technical precision under GPS-denied conditions, directly enabling the destruction of enemy artillery positions and the safe evacuation of Allied personnel. It sounded clean, too clean, a paragraph stripped of wind, fear, and heartbeat. She placed the tablet down. In the dim lamplight, her notebook weighted, edges still stiff with sand. She touched it lightly. It felt more real than the words on any screen. 2 tents away, laughter broke the stillness. A handful of soldiers were sharing rations, retelling her story with animated gestures. One of them, the sergeant from the basin, mimed climbing an invisible rope. She just went up like the wind had hands pushing her. The others chuckled. Then someone said softly, "You think she was scared?" The sergeant paused, eyes lowering. "Yeah," he said, "but she didn't show it. That's what got us out alive." Their voices faded into the hum of the generators. Elena listened from her cot, unseen. It wasn't pride she felt. It was something closer to ache. The climb had cost her more than skin and sweat. It had forced her to step out from the silence she'd built her life around, a silence she wasn't ready to lose. Days passed. The unit rotated missions, cleaned weapons, patched vehicles. But in every canteen, every corridor, every off-duty story, one name returned: Little Atlas. It was no longer a joke. It had become a call sign of quiet defiance, a symbol that not all strength came with volume. Even the senior officers began using it. "Check with Atlas for wind reports." "Atlas, we need drift correction." "Atlas, what's our window?" She answered each one the same way, calm, efficient, unflinching. But inside, the unease grew. Because every time they called her Atlas, she remembered the climb, the trembling in her hands, the voice that whispered, "Don't fall." They didn't see that part. They saw only the outcome, the myth. And myths are merciless things. They demand perfection from human hearts. Late one evening, she was summoned to the command tent. Inside, a senior intelligence officer waited, flanked by a communications aide holding a camera. "Lieutenant Morales," the officer began, "Public Affairs wants to run a profile on your mission, recruitment material, video interview, maybe footage from the Plateau. The public could use a story like this." Elena froze. Her throat felt dry. "Permission to decline, sir." The officer frowned. "Decline? This would highlight your contribution." "With respect, sir," she interrupted gently, "the story's not about me. It's about what the team accomplished." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Lieutenant, but the request will stay on record." She saluted, turned, and left. Outside, the night smelled of rain and burnt stone. She let the air fill her lungs. Recognition had never been her oxygen. Duty was. In the following days, she buried herself in work. Meteorology reports, supply manifests, training plans, anything to stay useful, invisible, normal. But even in silence, the legend grew louder. Mechanics painted a small blue prism on one of the transport trucks, Needle Rock. Recruits whispered about her in the mess hall. A technician taped 3 words above his weather station monitor: hold, calm, wind. It spread like wildfire but quiet, not shouted, carried like prayer. One afternoon, a young private approached her near the communications trailer. He held a torn notebook page, covered in messy handwriting. "Ma'am, I've been trying to understand your wind correction method. They say you can predict gust intervals just by feeling it." Alina smiled faintly, the first real smile in days. "Not feeling," she said, "listening." She crouched, picking up a handful of sand. It sifted through her fingers. "See how it moves? It doesn't fall straight. It dances sideways. That's a pattern rhythm between gusts. Measure that rhythm and you'll know the next one before it arrives." The private stared, fascinated. "That's beautiful," he said. She shook her head softly. "It's just math in motion." But her voice carried something else, a quiet pride, reluctant but genuine. For the first time, she saw her knowledge reflected in someone else's eyes, not as novelty, but as understanding. That night, thunder returned to the plateau. The storm rolled in slow, deliberate, like it was retracing the path she'd once climbed. Lightning flashed behind Needle Rock, illuminating it for just an instant, the prism at its peak still glinting faintly, untouched. Alina stood at the edge of the camp, rain soaking through her uniform, eyes fixed on that distant spire. It no longer looked like an obstacle. It looked like a mirror, something that had shown her who she was, and now refused to let her hide again. She felt the wind twist around her shoulders, colder than before. It whispered through her hair, the same way it had on that climb. "You wanted to be unseen," it seemed to say, "but you earned sight." Inside the operations tent, the sergeant watched her through the flap. He turned to Mason, the JTAC. "Think she'll ever let them pin that medal on her?" Mason smirked faintly. "Doubt it. She doesn't want to be a hero." "No," Mason said. "She just wants the wind to get the credit." When dawn came, Alina found a folded note slipped under her gear. No signature, just a line written in rough, pencil-scarred script. "We see you now. Thank you for climbing when we couldn't." She stared at it for a long time, before tucking it into her notebook between 2 weather tables. It stayed there, pressed flat, unspoken, but never forgotten. Weeks passed, the plateau changed, the fires cooled, the war rolled on, relentless. But everywhere she went, the symbol followed, a small prism drawn on the corner of mission boards, blue marker fading under sweat and dust. It wasn't glory. It was gravity, the quiet pull of example. Alina began to realize something profound. She'd stopped fighting the wind a long time ago. Now she was shaping it not by force, but by faith, in precision, in patience, in silence that carries weight. She wasn't just reading the wind anymore. She was teaching others how to listen. That night, under a sky clear enough to see constellations, she wrote again in her notebook. The words came slowly, shaped by reflection. "The storm reveals what silence builds." She stared at it until her eyes blurred. Then she closed the book, placed the shell casing against its cover, and whispered to the wind, "Thank you for not breaking me." The wind didn't answer. It never did. It just carried her words away, and perhaps that was enough. Why do heroes always disappear right after they're discovered? 2 months after the Needle Rock operation, the orders came through quietly. Reassignment, Training Command, Wind Effects and Optical Targeting Division. No ceremony, no farewell, just a signature and a sealed envelope. Her name on the transfer line looked foreign, like it belonged to someone else. Alina morale's packed in silence. Notebook, rifle log, the brass shell casing that had followed her through dust and fire. Everything else could stay behind. When she closed the duffel, the zipper sounded like the end of a chapter. The flight south took 4 hours. Below her, the landscape changed from scarred stone to open plains. The plateau disappeared beneath cloud cover, a ghost vanishing into its own legend. She pressed her forehead against the window and thought, "It's safer when no one remembers your face." At the new base, recruits called her ma'am with reverence that made her uncomfortable. They whispered before she entered a room, stood straighter than regulation required. On the range, some carried small blue ink prisms drawn on their notebooks, their lucky symbols. The myth had followed her here, and it had a longer reach than wind. Her first day in the training hangar, she wrote 3 words on the whiteboard. Hold calm, wind. No introduction, no story. Just that. The room of new soldiers stared, waiting for the speech they'd seen in recruitment clips, the speech she'd never given. She finally spoke, voice soft enough that they leaned forward to hear. "The wind doesn't hate you," she said. "It just doesn't care. Learn to read it and it'll carry you. Ignore it and it'll bury you." A pause. No applause. Only the steady hum of ceiling fans, imitating faraway gusts. In the weeks that followed, she taught by doing. She led them outside in all kinds of weather, scorching noon, bitter dawn, the strange metallic dusk that turns everything gray. She made them feel the difference between gust and drift, made them watch the way dust spiraled from boot prints, made them stand still long enough to sense pressure change behind their eardrums. Some complained. Some understood. But all of them eventually learned to listen. One afternoon, a recruit named Holloway asked, "Ma'am, did it really happen the way they say?" Elena looked at him, then at the horizon. "What do they say?" "That you stopped a war with 1 shot." She smiled faintly. 1 shot doesn't stop anything, it just changes what comes next. He nodded slowly, not sure whether he'd been corrected or enlightened. At night she returned to her quarters, a small concrete room that smelled of machine oil and rain. She kept the window open always, so the wind could find her. It still brought traces of the plateau dry mineral, a whisper of cordite. Sometimes she dreamed of the climb. Not the fear or the noise, but the rhythm, the invisible heartbeat that matched her own. In the dream, she never reached the top. She just kept climbing endlessly into sound and silence mixed together. And she always woke with the same thought. Maybe that's what courage is, motion without finish. The base commander visited one morning. He watched from the edge of the training field, as she instructed recruits to time their shots between gusts. When the exercise ended, he walked over, his boots sinking into the sand. "You know," he said, "we built this course because of you." Elena wiped grit from her hands. "Because of the mission, sir, not me." He smiled. "Same difference, isn't it?" She shook her head. "Difference is everything." The commander studied her. "You still think you're invisible, don't you?" She didn't answer. She just looked past him at the flag snapping in the crosswind and said quietly, "Invisibility kept me alive." He left her to the silence. Weeks turned into months. Recruits came and went. Some graduated, some washed out. But each left carrying something unseen. The way she had taught them to breathe before a trigger pull, the patience of waiting for the right wind window, the discipline of not rushing against chaos. They began to call it the needle doctrine. She never approved the name, but she didn't fight it either. If belief kept them steady in the storm, then let the myth do its work. One evening after dismissal, she found herself alone on the range. The air was perfectly still, rare for this place. She lifted her hand, palm open, feeling for movement. Nothing. She almost missed the noise of the plateau, the constant reminder that the world could turn violent in a breath. Stillness, she realized, could be more terrifying than storms. A distant voice startled her. "Permission to join, ma'am." It was Holloway again, the curious one. He carried 2 canteens and the wide-eyed humility of a man trying to understand the unreachable. She nodded. "What is it?" He handed her a canteen. "You always tell us to listen to the wind, but what if there's nothing to hear?" She considered the question for a long time. "Then you listen to yourself," she said. "If you can't hear your heartbeat, you're already too loud." He laughed softly, though he didn't quite grasp it. Most people didn't, not until the first real fight. As the months rolled on, the story of Needle Rock returned in fragments, a briefing slide here, a tactics manual there. She began to see her own name printed beneath diagrams she hadn't drawn, lessons she hadn't written. Every retelling trimmed a little truth, polished a little more legend. At first it bothered her. Then she realized legends aren't about accuracy, they're about endurance. So she let it be. Because somewhere out there, another wind would rise, and someone would need a story strong enough to hold on to. One night, heavy rain drummed on the tin roofs. The base power flickered. She sat at her desk, writing by lantern light. The notebook was nearly full now, its final pages stained with oil and fingerprints from countless students who'd borrowed it. She wrote slowly, deliberately. When all coordinates drift, create one that the wind cannot move. She underlined it once, then closed the book. Lightning flared outside. For a heartbeat, her reflection appeared in the window, tired eyes, thin scar along her cheek, hair pulled tight. Not the myth. Just the woman who'd survived the climb. And she smiled at her own ghost. A few days later, she was invited to speak at a graduation ceremony. She almost refused. Public speaking felt like standing in front of artillery fire, no cover, no rhythm to hide behind. But the commander insisted. "These kids need to hear from you." So she stood on the makeshift stage as the wind rolled across the field, snapping at the flags. Rows of new soldiers stared up, waiting for inspiration. Alina looked at them, faces full of potential and fear, and realized something. The plateau hadn't just tested her. It had prepared her for this. She spoke slowly, evenly. "Everyone wants to know how to be fearless," she began. "But fear is not your enemy, it's your measure. The moment you stop feeling it, you stop listening." The wind gusted, catching her words and scattering them like seeds. She raised her voice slightly. "Courage isn't climbing because you're sure you'll reach the top. It's climbing because others need you to try." A long silence followed. Then someone began to clap, not loud, just steady, rhythmic like the pulse of wind on canvas. Others joined, until the sound filled the field. Alina nodded once quietly and stepped down. For the first time, she didn't run from being seen. She just let it happen, like another current she could learn to ride. That night, she walked beyond the lights of the base to where the desert began. The wind had calmed again, cool and clean. She took the shell casing from her neck, rolled it between her fingers, then pressed it to the ground. "Stay," she whispered. Not as surrender, but as gratitude. She straightened, feeling the weight lift, the legend, the doubt, the invisible armor of silence. The wind moved around her ankles, gentle now. Maybe it was never about proving them wrong, she thought. Maybe it was about leaving something still enough for others to stand on. Back in the barracks, Holloway found her notebook on the desk. On the inside cover, she'd written a single line for whoever opened it next. "If the wind teaches you anything, let it be patience." He closed it carefully, as if afraid to disturb the words. Outside, the night shifted, a soft gust, almost a sigh. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the plateau waited, quiet and eternal. And though Alina Morales had left it behind, the lesson of that climb, the way she'd balanced fear, focus, and faith, had already become part of the air itself. Why do they always call you back the moment you finally find peace? It had been 9 months since Alina Morales last saw the plateau. 9 months of structured routines, quiet classrooms, and winds gentle enough to predict by instinct. She had started to believe maybe that part of her life was finished, that the mountain, the climb, the single impossible shot, had done its job and let her go. But the call came on a Wednesday. Reactivation order, operational support, task group 9. Destination, the same range of stone and silence where it all began. Only this time, she wasn't the unknown weather officer. This time, she was the myth they wanted back. She arrived to a base that looked different but smelled the same: diesel, dust, disinfectant, anticipation. The younger soldiers stared when she walked through the gates. Some whispered her call sign like it was sacred. Little Atlas. The new commander greeted her outside the hangar. He was younger than the last, his uniform too crisp, his confidence too loud. "Lieutenant Morales," he said, shaking her hand. "I've read the Needle Rock report 3 times. Incredible work." She nodded politely. "That was a team effort, sir." He smiled, the kind of smile that thinks it already understands everything. "I'm counting on you to do it again." Elena paused. "Do what exactly?" He gestured toward the horizon. "Enemies using signal jammers in the West Basin. We can't get coordinates. I hear you specialize in miracles." Later in the tactical tent, she studied the maps. The terrain was familiar: scarred ridges, broken radio coverage, unpredictable wind corridors. But something in her stomach tightened. Not fear, not yet. A warning, the kind that doesn't shout, only whispers. This is not the same storm. She asked for the meteorological data. There wasn't much: no recent readings, no ground sensors. The commander waved it off. "We'll improvise. You've done this before, right?" She looked at him, at the way he leaned on her reputation instead of preparation, and felt the weight of the legend pressing against her ribs. It had become armor for others, and a cage for her. That night she set up her instruments alone: anemometer, thermometer, barometer, compass. The wind hummed across the plain, steady but wrong. Too dry, too warm. A shift coming. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd filled on the plateau, its pages now soft with age. She began to write. Pressure drop, 0.09 millibars per hour. Wind direction, oscillating southwest to west-northwest. Thermal layer inversion forming before dawn. She stopped, tapping her pencil against the page. Something felt familiar, dangerously familiar. By morning, the forward platoon had moved into the basin. The ridge beyond it looked harmless, a smear of rust and basalt. But Elena knew better. She'd seen how wind turned terrain into a weapon. As she climbed the observation point with her rangefinder, the voice of the young commander crackled in her earpiece. "Morales, what's your read on visibility?" She scanned the horizon. Not visibility, movement, the sands rising in 2 directions at once. "That's just turbulence." "No, sir, it's refraction. There's something creating cross currents up there." He hesitated. "You think they're setting up artillery again?" She adjusted her scope, focusing on a thin shimmer at the edge of the ridge. "Metal, reflective, stationary." "I don't think," she said quietly. "I know." The first shell landed a minute later. The ground shook. Debris rained down. Radio chatter erupted in fragments, taking fire. "Zero line off. Coordinates unstable." Elena ducked behind a rock, shielding her equipment. Through the static, she heard the commander shouting, "Morales, give me numbers. Where the hell's the wind correction?" She pressed the transmit button, voice level. "Sir, you can't fire blind. We need a fixed point." "We don't have time for that." She looked back toward the ridge, the shimmer still there. There was no time, but there was always a way. She slung her pack over her shoulder. "Then I'll make one." By the time the others realized what she meant, she was already halfway up the slope. Her body remembered the climb, the rhythm, the way to breathe with the wind instead of against it. But this ridge wasn't Needle Rock. It was looser, crueler. Every hold crumbled under pressure. Below her, voices echoed through the headset. "Ma'am, you can't. Stay put, Morales. Let us send a drone." She muted the channel. Some things you couldn't explain in real time. Some actions had to speak alone. Halfway up, the wind changed direction. It roared down the valley, flattening her against the rock. Her nails dug into the basalt, boots scraping for grip. Her pulse matched the rhythm she'd once mastered, 3 beats calm, 1 beat move. When the gust eased, she continued. Every meter cost skin, but she didn't stop. At the summit, she found a fractured radio mast, probably abandoned by the last occupying force. Its metal skeleton leaned, creaking in the wind. Perfect. She tied her mirror prism to the top bracket, adjusted its angle by instinct, and clicked on the laser aligner from her pack. The reflection cut through the haze, bright enough to catch the JTAC's receiver below. In the radio, a voice broke through static. "Atlas, this is ground fire. We've got your signal. Lock confirmed. Repeat, lock confirmed." She exhaled, the sound lost to the wind. Her hands trembled as she aligned the secondary calibration. For the first time in hours, she let herself breathe and almost smiled. Then the second volley came. The ridge below her exploded. Shrapnel cut through the air like broken glass. The impact wave hit her chest. Her grip slipped. She fell not far, but far enough for the rope to snap taut and tear her glove. The pain shot up her arm. She caught herself barely. Her radio cracked with urgent voices. "Atlas, report, are you stable?" She stared at the blood spreading through her sleeve. "Stable enough," she whispered. With her good hand, she pulled the SR-25 from her pack. Through the scope, she saw the muzzle flash from the enemy position. She didn't have equations this time, no perfect notebook, no clean math. Just instinct and wind. She lined the shot. The world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. One squeeze. The rifle kicked. And then silence. The artillery position went dark. Below, the JTAC confirmed target neutralized. The platoon began advancing. The commander's voice returned, now edged with something close to awe. "Atlas, what the hell did you just do?" Elena pressed her shoulder against the rock, breathing hard. Reminded the wind who it works for. They found her half an hour later, still on the ridge, arm bleeding, expression unreadable. As medics wrapped her wound, she watched the horizon. Smoke rose again, curling into the same sky she'd once conquered. The commander crouched beside her. "You saved another team today," he said. She didn't look at him. "That's not the point." "What is?" "That it shouldn't take a legend to do the math." He frowned, not understanding. She didn't explain. Because explaining was for people who still believed wind obeyed rank. Back at the base, she refused the infirmary bed and sat outside instead, her arm in a sling, the night wind tugging at her hair. She could hear the men laughing inside the mess tent, the kind of laughter that follows survival. Her legend would grow again tonight. Another story retold, reshaped, red-idled. But sitting there under the same indifferent stars, Elena felt only distance between who she was and what they said she was. She closed her eyes and let the air move through her fingers. The wind still carried the same tone it had that first day, rough, honest, untamable. It didn't praise, it didn't pity. It simply was. The commander joined her briefly. "You know, they're already calling this Needle Rock too." Elena smiled faintly. "That's lazy nomming." He chuckled. "Maybe, but morale through the roof." She nodded slowly. "Good, they'll need it." He looked at her, puzzled. "Need it for what?" "For the next storm," she said softly. "It's always coming." When he left, she took out her notebook. The pages fluttered in the breeze, the old sand still clinging to their corners. She wrote slowly with her left hand. The wind repeats its lessons until you learn to listen without fear. She closed the book and pressed it against her chest. Her heartbeat drummed beneath it, steady, human, imperfect. She wasn't the myth. She was the reminder that even legends bleed. And as the wind rose again across the plain, carrying the smell of dust and distance, she whispered the words that had always steadied her hand. Hold. Calm. Wind. When the body breaks before the spirit does, which one heals first? The medevac helicopter left dust spiraling behind it, a storm in miniature. Inside, Elena Morales sat buckled to the bench, her right arm bandaged to the elbow, the metallic tang of antiseptic sharp in her throat. Across from her, a medic tried small talk, the kind soldiers use to fill silence before guilt arrives. Hell of a shot, ma'am. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window where the plateau shrank to nothing, swallowed by cloud and distance. Every rotation of the rotor felt like a heartbeat she didn't trust anymore. They brought her to the field hospital, a place built from canvas and fluorescent light. The walls hummed with machines and whispered names. She hated it instantly, the way sound carried, the way stillness felt like accusation. Doctors checked for nerve damage. They asked about pain. She nodded to every question, said fine when she meant enough. One nurse adjusted her sling and said quietly, "You're the one from Needle Rock, aren't you?" Elena looked at her. That was a long time ago. The nurse smiled, not to the people who tell the story. That was the problem. Stories never stayed in the past. They followed you like shadows that learned to speak. Days passed. She tried to sleep. She couldn't. Every time her eyelids closed, she saw light, muzzle flash, exploding ridge, the sudden fall that hadn't killed her. She'd been trained to accept risk, but not this. This quiet unraveling that came afterward, when the adrenaline left and the questions arrived. What if she'd misread the gust? What if the prism had slipped? What if someone else had fallen in her place? The questions were endless and circular, a wind that turned inward. After a week, the base commander came to visit. Not the young one from the mission. This was an older officer, eyes lined from years of bad decisions made for good reasons. He carried 2 cups of instant coffee. "Mind if I sit?" She nodded. He placed 1 cup near her uninjured hand. "You saved a dozen people again. That's twice you've done what most think impossible." She stared at the cup. "And what does that make me, sir? A tool, a headline?" He sighed. "It makes you a reference point." She looked up sharply, like a coordinate. "Exactly. When the world's spinning, they need something fixed." She turned the words over in her head. They sounded noble but heavy. Being a fixed point meant you couldn't move, couldn't break, couldn't rest. And she was so very tired. When her arm finally healed enough to remove the sling, she asked to return to duty. The doctors hesitated. The commander approved. "You'll assist in strategic planning," he said. "No climbing, no shooting, just thinking." She almost laughed, thinking the dangerous part. Still, she returned. The operations room smelled of paper, ink, and new fear. She took a seat at the far end of the table, listening as younger officers argued over tactics. They spoke fast, quoting her old reports as if reciting scripture. Wind pattern identical to Morale's model. She proved optical locks outperform GPS. If we hold for a calm window, we can replicate her method. Her name became data. Her life became equation. Finally, she interrupted. "You're misreading the principle," she said quietly. "It wasn't about repeating. It was about adapting." They fell silent. One asked, cautious, "Then what's the real lesson, ma'am?" She met their eyes, voice steady. "The wind never gives you the same test twice." That night she walked alone outside the wire. Her steps crunched over dry clay. The sky was full of slow-moving clouds that refused to break open. She thought about all the people she'd taught, all the soldiers who now carried fragments of her methods like talismans. Maybe that was the price of survival, becoming symbol first, person later. She sat on a supply crate and let the air move around her. It smelled faintly of rain and metal. In the distance, generator lights flickered like fireflies. "Maybe this is all the peace we get," she whispered to no one. The wind answered by shifting direction. 2 days later, she was invited to brief a multinational unit arriving for joint operations. They'd heard of her, everyone had, and wanted her to teach the morale's protocol. She stood before them with one arm still stiff, and a face the camera crews had learned not to film. On the screen behind her, slides flickered, airflow diagrams, optical geometry, correction formulas. Clean, precise, lifeless. She turned the projector off. "Forget the numbers," she said. "They won't save you." Murmurs rippled through the room. "What will?" someone asked. She looked around, faces waiting for formulas. She gave them truth instead. Discipline will, listening will, courage will, but only if you remember one thing: every calculation comes with a heartbeat attached. Don't ever forget the human part of the math. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It felt like understanding. After the briefing, a captain approached her outside. He was older than most, eyes the color of worn denim. "Lieutenant, my daughter's in training back home," he said. "She sent me a message last week. Said she joined because she read about you." Elena's breath caught. "I never meant to recruit anyone." He smiled. "You didn't, you just reminded her it was possible." She nodded, unsure what to do with the warmth in her chest. Admiration had always felt like pressure. This felt like release. That night, rain finally came. Hard, cleansing rain that flattened the dust and drowned the noise. She stood in it until her clothes clung and her skin went cold. It felt like honesty, like the earth reminding her she was still small. When she went back inside, she took out her notebook again. The pages blurred from the damp. She wrote with careful strokes. "Being strong is not the same as being stone." She underlined it twice. Then she added, "Sometimes the fixed point has to move, just enough to show others where to stand." Morning brought orders again, not for combat but for consultation. Another unit had misread atmospheric data, lost a drone, nearly lost lives. They wanted her assessment. As she studied their logs, she realized they followed her published parameters exactly. Perfect replication. And it had failed. She smiled almost sadly. "They learned the method," she murmured, "but not the listening." So she spent the day rewriting the manual, replacing half the equations with notes like "feel pressure before gust," "trust ear over instrument," "pause before certainty." When she handed it in, the clerk frowned. "This looks incomplete." She said, "That's because it's alive." That evening, Holloway, now promoted, hair shorter, eyes steadier, arrived at her door. He carried a fresh notebook and a cautious grin. "Ma'am, I'm heading out tomorrow. Thought you might sign this for luck." She took the notebook, hesitated, then wrote inside the cover. "Don't look for calm, create it." He read the words, nodded, and said quietly, "We'll hold the wind, ma'am." She smiled. "No, Sergeant, let it hold you." After he left, she sat on her bunk, listening to the night settle. Somewhere a generator coughed, then steadied. The rhythm matched her breathing. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the need to measure, calculate, or prove. She simply was human, fallible, still learning. She realized the legend wasn't something outside her anymore. It was something she'd outgrown, a shell that had cracked open to let life back in. Near midnight, she walked again beyond the perimeter. The rain had stopped. The air shimmered with that fresh-washed clarity that comes only after surrender. The stars looked close enough to touch. She whispered to the sky, not as prayer but as conversation. I'm still here, not fixed, just steady enough. The wind rose briefly, brushed her cheek and moved on, a nod from the universe. She closed her eyes and felt the peace she'd been chasing finally arrive, quiet, imperfect, real. And as she turned back toward the camp lights, she said the words that had guided every climb, every fall, every rebirth. Hold. Calm. Wind. When does a legend stop, belonging to the one who lived it? The morning reports came in with the usual noise, coordinates, logistics, casualty counts. But one message stood out, printed in shaky handwriting across the last page. Requesting guidance from LT, Morales, wind inversion forming near Ridge 27, no stable coordinates, needle doctrine suggests wait window. Alina read it twice, then again. She hadn't been to Ridge 27, but she knew the pattern by heart. Fast descents, katabatic wind pulses, dust rising from both directions. A smaller echo of the same storm that had made her name. She stared at the words until they blurred. They were asking for her method, her permission, her courage. And for the first time in years, she realized it wasn't hers anymore. The message came from a young corporal named Cira Mendez. 22. Graduated from the new meteorology and targeting program, the one Alina had helped design but never taught. Reports said Cira had been pinned with her unit in a narrow basin, their drone downed, their GPS jammed. Wind unstable, visibility collapsing. Sounded too familiar, too cruelly poetic. Alina closed the folder and whispered, "Don't make my mistake, kid. Don't climb what you don't have to." By noon, command requested her presence in the operations room. A major pointed at the flickering map display. "Your doctrine in play out there, Lieutenant. They're trying to hold the pattern but losing signal. We can't get them coordinates." Alina leaned over the table, eyes narrowing. "They're misreading the interval. The window hasn't opened yet." The major frowned. "Can you guide them remotely?" She hesitated. Her chest felt tight. Guiding meant taking responsibility for someone else's decision, someone who might die carrying her name. Still, she keyed the mic. "This is Morales. Who's on the line?" Static, then a young voice, steady but trembling at the edges. "Corporal Mendez, ma'am." "Status." "Wind's tearing up the sensors. We're blind on both flanks. My commanding officer's down. We're trying to hold, but—" Her voice broke. Alina waited, but we can't wait much longer. Enemies moving artillery into position." Alina closed her eyes. Every sound, the hum of electronics, the ticking clock, disappeared. It was needle rock all over again, but this time, she wasn't the one holding the rope. "Listen carefully, Mendez," she said quietly. "You don't move yet. Count the gusts. 3 heavy, 1 light, that's your cycle. Between the 3rd and the 4th, the air pressure drops. That's your door. How long will it stay open?" 2 seconds, maybe less. Silence then. "Copy that, ma'am." Alina exhaled, fingers gripping the edge of the console. She heard movement, voices shouting in the background, the ragged rhythm of someone preparing to defy gravity. Minutes passed. The map flickered. No signal. The major looked at her. "We lost them." Alina shook her head slowly. "No, she's just in the climb." When the radio came back, the first sound was breathing. Then a half-whisper, "Prism placed, optical lock acquired, coordinates steady." The room erupted in relieved murmurs. Alina leaned forward. "Good work, Mendez, get down now." A pause. Then the younger woman said something Alina would never forget. "Permission to fire, ma'am." Alina froze. "Do you have visual?" "Yes." "Do you have wind correction?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you don't need my permission." The line went quiet. 1 heartbeat, 2. Then the unmistakable sound of a single shot. The explosion registered on the satellite feed seconds later. Enemy artillery gone. The ridge safe. Cheers broke out across the command tent. Someone clapped her shoulder. You trained her well. Elena didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the monitor where dust still swirled. She whispered under her breath, I didn't train her. I just left a map she learned to read better. Hours later, the survivors were extracted. Corporal Sierra Mendez was alive. Slightly concussed. Her report would later read applied morales density wind correction manually, established fixed optical reference, fired on propellant stock, successful detonation. Simple words, no mention of fear. No mention of how her hands had probably shaken, or how the silence must have sounded before the shot. Alina knew because she'd lived it. That evening she sat alone in her quarters, the radio replaying distant chatter. A younger version of her had just been born in courage, in chaos, in consequence. She thought she'd feel pride. Instead, she felt something heavier. The cycle had repeated. The wind had found another listener. And she, the original, had to accept that legends don't end with applause. They end with inheritance. A knock broke her thoughts. It was Holloway again, older now, uniform streaked with dust. They made it back, he said. Kids got half the base talking. Everyone's calling her Little Atlas too. Elena laughed softly, not joy, not mockery, something between. Let's not do that again. He smiled. She saved her unit. I know, Elena said quietly, and she's going to carry that forever. He tilted his head, like you. She looked out the window where night pressed against glass. No, better, because she didn't climb to prove herself. She climbed because others needed her too. Later that night, she requested a direct line to the hospital tent where Mendez was being treated. When the young corporal answered, her voice was groggy but lucid. Ma'am. Elena smiled faintly. You did well. Thank you, ma'am. I just followed your notes. Elena paused. No, you followed your own wind. Mendez hesitated. Is it true, ma'am, what they say about the climb? Depends on who's talking. They say you weren't scared. Elena's eyes softened. They're wrong. Silence stretched between them, fragile and human. Then Elena said, remember this, fear means you still care what happens next. Never lose that. Yes, ma'am. Get some rest, Corporal. Ma'am. Yes. When I was halfway up, I thought I heard someone counting wind cycles. Thought maybe it was you. Elena smiled. Maybe it was just the wind remembering. When the line went quiet, she sat back and closed her eyes. The exhaustion came all at once, not just from the day, but from years of holding steady while the world demanded constancy. She realized that the point of being a fixed coordinate wasn't to remain still forever. It was to help others orient, then step aside when they could navigate on their own. The next morning, the base felt different. Lighter. People moved with renewed rhythm, a quiet confidence that didn't come from orders or technology, but from understanding something elemental, that precision and patience could still win wars better than volume ever would. As she walked across the yard, a young soldier saluted. Morning, ma'am. Elena returned it. Morning, wind steady. Yes, ma'am. Good, she said, then make it count. That evening she climbed the small watchtower near the perimeter. Not high, not legendary, but just enough to see the horizon glow with the last amber light of day. She could almost imagine the silhouette of Needle Rock far in the distance, like a memory refusing to fade. The wind rose, soft and constant. She spoke to it the way old friends do, without expectation. You found another, she murmured. Good. The wind shifted direction, playful, almost approving. She smiled. Don't get sentimental on me. It blew harder, as if laughing. For the first time in years, she laughed back. Later in her journal she wrote, "If I disappear tomorrow, the wind will keep teaching. I was never the lesson. I was just the echo that showed where to listen." She underlined it once. Then, without thinking, she added the 3 words that had carried her through everything. The ones now spreading through manuals, through whispers, through generations of soldiers learning to move with the invisible. Hold. Calm. Wind. What happens when the wind finally stops calling your name? It had been 2 years since Needle Rock, a year since Ridge 27, and 6 months since anyone last called her Atlas. Elena Morales sat at a small airfield far from any map that mattered. The wars had moved elsewhere, as they always did, following the latest coordinates of fear. She lived now in a village where the hills rolled green instead of brown, where the wind came not as warning but as memory. The locals knew her only as Elena, the woman who fixed radios and sometimes stared too long at the sky. She liked it that way. No rank, no legend, no eyes waiting for miracles. Just air and quiet and time. Every morning she climbed a narrow ridge behind her cottage, not to measure, not to predict, but to breathe. She'd stand at the top, face the sunrise, and let the wind thread through her hair like an old friend checking in. Sometimes she'd smile and say, "Still here." And sometimes the wind would answer, a gentle gust, playful and familiar. Peace, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of storms. It was learning which ones deserved your fight. One afternoon, a military jeep pulled up outside her house. Dust swirled, settling on the unpainted fence. A young woman stepped out, uniform sharp, posture practiced. "Elena Morales?" she asked. Elena didn't answer right away. She just studied her, the way her eyes carried purpose, the kind born from stories. "Yes," Elena finally said, "that's me most days." The young soldier smiled nervously. "Corporal Sierra Mendez, ma'am." Elena's expression softened. "You made it." "Yes, ma'am, thanks to you." Elena shook her head gently. "Thanks to the wind." They sat outside on the porch, the air thick with afternoon warmth. Sierra removed her cap, fidgeting like a student before a teacher. "I wanted to see you in person," she said, "to tell you the doctrine's changed. They've named it adaptive flow theory. Your notes became part of the standard manual." Elena chuckled softly. "That's a terrible name." Sierra grinned. "Maybe, but it's saving lives." They sat in silence for a while, watching the grass move like a living tide. Then Sierra said quietly, "You know, I still count the gusts when I get scared. 3 heavy, 1 light, it works." Elena's eyes glistened, with something between pride and sorrow. "Good, just remember it's not about the counting. It's about the listening." "I know," Sierra said, "you taught us that." Elena shook her head. "No, I just reminded you what you already knew. Nature doesn't follow orders, it follows honesty." When evening fell, Sierra rose to leave. Before she did, she handed Elena a sealed envelope. "Command wanted me to deliver this personally." Elena hesitated before opening it. Inside was an official letter, transfer orders, though none for her. It was a ceremonial request. "The Armed Forces Meteorological Academy hereby extends an invitation to Lt. Elena Morales to serve as honorary instructor and advisor." At the bottom, in faint ink, was a handwritten note from the Chief of Staff. "You taught us to read the air. Now teach us how to live with it." Elena smiled, small and sad. She looked up at Sierra. "You think they're ready for stories with fewer heroes?" Sierra smiled back. "If they're not, they will be." That night, after the jeep disappeared into the distance, Elena sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold. The stars stretched clear above her, infinite and indifferent. She thought about the academy, the lectures, the students, the uniforms all shining and new. And she thought about how legends never end. They just learned to speak softer. For years she had carried silence like a weapon. Now she wondered if it could be used for healing instead. Weeks later, she walked into the academy auditorium for the first time. Rows of cadets stood at attention, whispering her name under their breath. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing against her shoulders. But instead of saluting, she just smiled and said, "Relax, the wind doesn't salute anyone." Laughter rippled through the room, the tension eased. She began her lecture not with numbers, but with a story. About a time when she misjudged a storm and nearly cost her team their lives. About a moment she froze, not from fear of dying, but from fear of failing those who believed in her. And about the day she finally learned that leadership wasn't control, it was trust. When she finished, no one clapped. They just sat there quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. And that was enough. After class, one young cadet lingered behind. He looked nervous, his notebook half closed. "Ma'am," he said, "how do you know when you're ready?" Alina thought about it. Then she walked to the window, opened it, and let the breeze roll in. "You're ready," she said, "the moment you stop needing to prove it." He nodded slowly, as if that single sentence had shifted something fundamental. As he left, she whispered after him, "And don't forget to listen." Years went by. She taught when she could, repaired radios when she wanted, and climbed hills when she needed to think. Sometimes veterans would visit, just to shake her hand. Sometimes strangers would write letters, calling her the woman who taught the wind to wait. She never replied, because that wasn't true. She hadn't taught the wind anything. She'd simply stopped fighting it long enough to understand what it was saying. On her last day at the academy, the staff gathered in the courtyard to see her off. Someone had arranged a small plaque, nothing ornate, just brushed steel engraved with a quote attributed to her. "Hold calm, wind." She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "It was never about me." A breeze lifted the edge of her coat. And she smiled, as if the air itself had finally confirmed what she always knew. That evening, she drove back to her village alone. The sun was setting, a slow descent through colors that felt like closure. When she reached the ridge behind her home, she climbed one last time. Her body was older, slower, but her rhythm was the same. 3 breaths calm, 1 to move. At the top, she watched the horizon fade into gold and shadow. Below her, the world was still, not in victory, not in defeat, just in balance. She thought of every soldier who'd whispered her mantra before firing a shot. Every storm that had carried her lessons. Every heart that had learned that strength didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it waited. She closed her eyes, felt the wind touch her face, and let go of everything else. Later, the villagers would find her notebook on the ridge. The final page held a few words written in her unmistakably steady hand. "If I have learned anything, it is this. The world doesn't need heroes who command the storm. It needs listeners who understand its rhythm. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." And when the wind swept across the plateau again months later, some said it carried a voice, low, calm, unwavering, counting softly through the gusts. 3 heavy, 1 light.